She was once the most powerful woman in China, a symbol of love that conquered the emperor himself. Yet in 91 BC, at the age of 29, Empress Wei Zifu was forced to take her own life. From a lowly singer in the palace to the most adored consort of Emperor Wu, her rise was dazzling, and her fall merciless. Her death remains a mirror of how absolute power devours even love itself. In the lower chambers of Changmen Palace, where the light of the sun rarely touched the ground, a young girl's voice once floated like mist over still water. Her name was Wei Zifu. Born into a family with nothing to offer but honesty and silence, she was sent to the palace as a singer, a mere shadow in the orchestra of imperial pleasures. At night, the courtyards were filled with the soft sounds of flutes and zithers. Yet her voice carried differently. It was not trained for perfection, but for longing. Her tone had the purity of spring water flowing between stones, gentle, restrained, and painfully human. The palace women often said that when she sang, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Wei Zifu lived under the patronage of Princess Pingyang, the elder sister of Emperor Wu. To serve in the princess's household meant obscurity. It was a world beneath the golden stairs of the emperor's court. The singers there learned early that beauty could be both a gift and a punishment. But Wei Zifu's beauty was quiet, like moonlight that did not seek to be noticed. Until the day fate arranged a meeting that would alter the history of an empire. When Emperor Wu visited his sister's palace, the halls shimmered with light and music. He was young, ambitious, and surrounded by power, yet weary of the same faces that praised him. Then came a song. It began softly, as if it rose from a hidden spring beneath the marble floor. He turned and saw her. She did not look at him directly. Her gaze was lowered, respectful, yet the air between them quivered. The emperor, accustomed to command, found himself listening, truly listening, for the first time in years. In her voice, he heard not flattery, but truth, not submission, but a kind of quiet strength that defied his throne. It was a sound of simplicity in a world drowning in gold. After the performance, silence lingered longer than applause. The emperor asked her name, and when she replied, Wei Zifu, even the syllables felt gentle. That night, he could not sleep. The song returned to him like a fragrance he could not forget. A few days later, he summoned her to his own palace. For Wei Zifu, that journey was both an ascent and an end. She left behind the dim corridors where she had sung, carrying nothing but the memory of her own echo. The court whispered, "A new star rises." But in the celestial order of the Han court, every star that rose too brightly risked being swallowed by the same sky that birthed it. The court of Emperor Wu was a world built on ritual and distance. No one approached him without fear, no one spoke without permission. Yet when Wei Zifu entered his chambers, the air itself seemed to soften. She did not adorn herself with jewels. Her robe was plain, her hair simply tied. But when she smiled, it was as if the heavy pillars of the palace drew breath again. Their love began quietly. He would ask her to sing at dusk, when the lanterns flickered like stars and the fragrance of burning sandalwood filled the room. Sometimes he would sit in silence, watching the light play across her face, wondering how something so delicate could feel more enduring than all the monuments he had built. In her, he found what power could never give: peace. Months passed, and she bore him a son, the first prince of his line. The empire celebrated with thunderous joy. Courtiers bowed, poets wrote verses, and the emperor's heart was full. In Wei Zifu's embrace, he saw not only love, but legacy. She became the embodiment of virtue, the image of a woman who had risen from nothing to hold the destiny of an empire in her arms. But beneath the music and laughter, the storm had already begun to gather. The court was filled with envy. Old nobles murmured that she was unworthy, that her blood was too common. They feared her quiet influence, the way she could turn the emperor's gaze away from them with a single glance. Wei Zifu, unaware of how fragile favor could be, continued to live simply. She still sang, though now her songs carried new meanings, less of hope, more of gratitude, tinged with fear. In the evenings, she would look out across the endless roofs of the palace and whisper to herself, "Even the stars cannot shine forever." For now, though, the emperor's love protected her. Power bowed before affection, and for a brief moment in history, love seemed to triumph over the cruelty of the throne. Years passed like petals falling into a still pond, quietly, beautifully, without warning. The empire thrived under Emperor Wu's expanding ambition. Wars were fought, borders pushed, temples built. Yet within the gilded walls of the palace, one story bloomed that seemed to defy the logic of power itself. The story of Wei Zifu. After many years of waiting, Emperor Wu finally made his decision. He dethroned Empress Zhao, whose jealousy and sorcery had cast dark shadows upon the court, and in her place he elevated Wei Zifu, the girl who once sang in the lower halls, to the title of Empress. The ceremony was grand, yet solemn. Drums echoed through Chang'an, and banners bearing the imperial dragon swayed under the wind. For the people, it was a symbol of purity restored. For Wei Zifu, it was the realization of both a dream and a curse. As she ascended the marble steps of the Hall of Radiant Virtue, she carried no pride in her heart. She had seen too many faces rise and fall. Her crown was heavy, not with jewels, but with the weight of countless gazes. Those of servants, courtiers, and consorts who watched her every breath. Once, her voice had been her freedom. Now, her silence became her shield. The emperor adored her still. He would visit her chambers late at night, away from prying eyes, to speak not as ruler and subject, but as two souls bound by memory. He would remind her of the song she once sang, and she would smile, though her heart already trembled with the foreboding of impermanence. For in the palace, love was not eternal. It was a season, and seasons always changed. Time, as it always does, began to erode tenderness. The emperor's heart, restless by nature, found new fascinations, younger faces, newer voices. Wei Zifu, though still respected, felt the subtle chill of distance creeping in. Her son, Crown Prince Liu Ju, grew into a noble and capable young man. He was wise, compassionate, and deeply filial, the hope of the dynasty. But in the same way her beauty once provoked envy, his virtue began to provoke fear. Rumors whispered like serpents slithering through silk corridors. Ministers spoke of omens, of rebellion, of dark arts whispered within the queen's residence. Wei Zifu could not understand how swiftly devotion had turned to suspicion. The same empire that had lifted her up now began to prepare her fall. Still, she kept her composure. Each morning she dressed carefully, attended ceremonies, and fulfilled her duties as empress with calm dignity. But in her solitude, she often touched the bronze mirror that once reflected her youth. Its surface had dulled, as had her smile. The reflection that stared back no longer belonged to the girl who had sung beneath lantern light. It belonged to a woman surrounded by shadows she could not name. As the empire expanded, so too did Emperor Wu's paranoia. He had conquered lands and enemies, yet he could not conquer fear, fear of betrayal, fear of mortality, fear that even his closest kin might covet his throne. The palace, once filled with laughter and music, became a labyrinth of spies, secrets, and whispered accusations. Wei Zifu felt this shift before anyone else. She saw it in the emperor's eyes, the hesitation, the distance, the strange pauses when her son's name was mentioned. What once was love had become an inspection. Every word weighed, every silence questioned. The emperor began to trust the tongues of ministers more than the hearts of his family. In this tense atmosphere, a cunning official named Jiang Chong planted the seed of destruction. He accused Crown Prince Liu Ju of practicing witchcraft to hasten his father's death. The charge was absurd, yet in a court ruled by fear, absurdity could become truth overnight. The emperor, shaken by omens and old age, began to doubt even the light of his own house. The prince, shocked and desperate to defend his innocence, found no one willing to listen. The courtiers who once praised him now looked away. His own father refused an audience. He turned to his mother, Wei Zifu, whose calm eyes were now filled with silent terror. She urged him to stay still, to wait, to trust that justice would prevail. But in the empire of suspicion, justice was already dead. Day by day, imperial guards began to patrol near the crown prince's residence. Servants vanished without trace. Rumors grew that the prince was plotting a coup. To survive meant to act. And so, in one moment of impossible choice, Liu Ju gathered his loyal guards and struck first. For 6 days, the capital burned. The air reeked of smoke and betrayal. Wei Zifu, locked inside her chambers, could only listen to the echoes of battle beyond the walls. Each clang of steel felt like a heartbeat being torn apart. When the rebellion failed, the prince took his own life to escape humiliation. The news reached her before dawn, a single sentence that turned the world to ash. The crown prince is dead. Wei Zifu did not cry. She simply stood before her mirror and whispered his childhood name, as if the sound alone could call him back. Outside, the emperor's banners of victory fluttered again. But within the palace, a mother's silence became the loudest grief in history. When despair turns into resolve, even loyalty can look like rebellion. Crown Prince Liu Ju had been raised to embody virtue. He studied the classics, honored his parents, and sought no pleasure but duty. Yet in the final days of his life, duty itself became a curse. When the accusations of witchcraft grew louder, when courtiers whispered behind his back and his father refused to see him, the young prince understood that silence would only lead him to the executioner's blade. He decided to fight. It was not the rebellion of ambition, but the rebellion of survival. He called his few loyal guards and officials, their faces pale in the flickering light of the palace lamps. Outside, thunder rumbled. An omen, they said. But Liu Ju's voice was steady. If I must die, he told them, then I will die standing. If truth no longer has a place in this court, then let my sword speak for it. The uprising began before dawn. The prince's soldiers stormed the outer gates of the capital, catching the imperial guard off balance. For a moment, it seemed the tide might turn. Citizens, confused and terrified, shut their doors as flames began to climb the wooden towers of Chang'an. The once orderly city became a theater of panic, drums beating, torches falling, banners torn. In the Empress's quarters, Wei Zifu knelt before her altar. Clutching her son's childhood amulet, she could hear the cries from beyond the walls, the clash of armor, the desperate commands, the echo of her son's name shouted through smoke. But she could not go to him. Palace guards sealed the corridors, forbidding her to leave. every sound that reached her heart was a wound that would never heal. By the 6th day, the rebellion had collapsed. Betrayal, as it always does, came from within. One of the prince's trusted generals turned against him, opening the gates to the imperial forces. Surrounded and outnumbered, Liu Zhu refused to surrender. Rather than be dragged before his father in chains, he took his own life with the dagger that had once been his symbol of command. When the message reached Emperor Wu, he said nothing. Only his eyes darkened, not with grief, but with the exhaustion of a man who had been deceived by his own fears. He ordered an investigation, not to find truth, but to erase it. Everyone connected to the prince, ministers, servants, even guards, were executed. The blood of thousands washed the streets of Chang'an. Wei Zifu was left alone in silence. The Empress of Han, once surrounded by music and praise, now lived in a palace where every corridor smelled of smoke and absence. She did not weep. Her tears had already run dry. Instead, she sat beside the bronze mirror that had followed her from youth to power and whispered, "My child has returned to the stars." Outside, the empire continued as if nothing had happened. But within the walls of the palace, love, once the heartbeat of a dynasty, had died without a sound. After the death of the crown prince, the court's thirst for accusation did not end. It never does. Once the machinery of fear begins to turn, it demands more victims to justify its motion. Wei Zifu, the mother of the fallen prince, became its next offering. Zhang Chong, the same official who had destroyed her son, now turned his words against her. He claimed that the empress herself had dabbled in witchcraft, that she had plotted with the prince to summon spirits and overthrow the throne. The charge was monstrous, yet it found eager believers. Fear had replaced truth as the law of the empire. Emperor Wu, now aging and sickly, withdrew further into suspicion. His counselors, anxious to preserve their favor, fed his paranoia like priests tending to a sacred fire. In whispers, they spoke of omens, of strange dreams, of curses, of shadows in the corridors of the Empress's quarters. They told him that the spirits of the dead sought vengeance. He listened. Wei Zifu was confined to her chambers. Her servants were dismissed, her food rationed. The once bright silk drapes of her hall hung limp and gray with dust. The courtyards that had once echoed with laughter now fell silent except for the cawing of distant crows. The Empress, who had once been the heart of the palace, had become its ghost. She never pleaded for mercy. Instead, she sat before her altar, burning incense for her dead son. Each night, she recited the same prayer, not for her own survival, but for clarity in the emperor's heart. But clarity never came. When the imperial decree finally arrived, it bore the cold formality of bureaucracy. The empress is to be questioned on charges of treason and sorcery. She understood what that meant. There would be no trial, no defense, no redemption. The words themselves were the sentence. In the garden outside her window, the chrysanthemums had begun to bloom. Their scent filled the air, clean, bittersweet, eternal. Wei Zifu smiled faintly, realizing that the season had come full circle. Autumn again. The same season when she had once sung before the emperor, the same soft wind that had carried her voice into his heart. Now that same wind would carry her name into silence. Her downfall was not loud. It was quiet, a slow erasure, the kind that history performs without cruelty, but also without mercy. In the records of the court, her name would soon be accompanied by a single word: witch. No one would dare speak against it, not even the emperor. And yet, Somewhere deep within the palace walls, perhaps he heard the faint echo of a song. The same song that had once made him believe that love could outlast power. But belief is fragile, and power has no memory. The corridors that once echoed with footsteps and laughter had turned to silence. Wei Zifu's quarters, once fragrant with orchids and sandalwood, now smelled faintly of dust and neglect. The lanterns were unlit. Curtains hung like the drooping wings of dying moths. The Empress, who had once been surrounded by attendants and musicians, now sat alone before a bronze mirror whose surface had grown opaque with age. Every morning, she would rise and dress as though the ritual still mattered. Her hands moved with the same grace, the same precision. She arranged her hair into the intricate coils befitting an empress, pinned with gold ornaments dulled by years of sorrow. But there were no eyes left to witness her dignity. The silence itself became her court. Outside, autumn winds carried whispers of her fate through the palace. The younger concubines spoke her name in fear, not pity, as though even compassion for a condemned woman might invite misfortune. Ministers walked past her residence without looking. Her name had become a ghost before she herself had died. Sometimes she would sit by the lattice window and watch the play of light across the garden. A single maple tree stood there, its leaves turning crimson with the season. In that red, she saw both beauty and prophecy. Each leaf that fell seemed to whisper, "You have been loved, and now you are forgotten." At night, the sounds of the palace changed. The cries of birds, the rustle of silk banners in the courtyard. All seemed amplified in her solitude. She began to hear things that were not there. The echo of her son's laughter, the faint notes of a zither. The voice of the emperor calling her name as he once did when love was young. These ghosts of memory were her only visitors. One evening, a faint drizzle fell. The sound of rain against the roof tiles reminded her of the days when the emperor would come to her chambers and ask for a song. She took up the old zither, untouched for years, and ran her fingers across the strings. The notes came out brittle, fragmented, like the remnants of a broken life. Her song had once made the emperor pause his wars. Now, even heaven did not listen. Still, she sang, not for the court, not for him, but for herself. It was the last act of defiance she could offer. In that melody, there was neither despair nor hope, only acceptance. When the final note faded, she looked around the empty chamber and whispered, "This is what remains of a heart that once belonged to the emperor of all under heaven." She blew out the lamp and closed her eyes. Darkness at last was kind. The summons came at dawn. A single messenger entered the empress's chambers, carrying a sealed order and a small jade cup covered with a cloth. He did not speak. He simply knelt and placed the cup on the table before her, then retreated into the shadows. Wei Zifu understood immediately. No one needed to tell her what the cup contained. The scent of bitter herbs rose faintly in the air, familiar, inevitable. She looked at it for a long while, her fingers trembling slightly. In that simple vessel lay the sum of all that her life had been: love, power, betrayal, and silence. She poured herself a final cup of tea first, setting it beside the poison as if to remind herself that choice still existed, if only symbolically. The steam curled upward, catching the morning light. She smiled faintly, a gesture of serenity in a world that had offered her none. She turned to the bronze mirror once more. The reflection staring back was calm, almost detached. She had been a daughter, a singer, a lover, a mother, an empress, and now, merely a woman waiting for the end. Softly, she whispered to her reflection, "If there is another life, let me be a commoner." Let me love without fear. Let me die without being forgotten." Her hands did not shake when she lifted the jade cup. She brought it close to her lips, inhaling the faint scent of almond and iron. Before drinking, she bowed 3 times toward the direction of the emperor's quarters. Not in reverence, but in farewell. The poison was cold. It burned not in fire, but in silence. Moments later, she felt her body grow heavy. The edges of the room blurred. She lay back upon the mat, her eyes open to the ceiling she had once watched in happier days. Outside, the autumn wind carried the sound of falling leaves through the open window. As the final breath escaped her lips, the mirror on the table caught a flicker of light, perhaps the last remnant of her spirit, leaving the palace that had both crowned and destroyed her. When the servants entered hours later, they found her lying gracefully, as though asleep. Her face bore no trace of pain, only peace, the kind that is born when one has finally stopped resisting the cruelty of fate. The cup was empty. The incense had burned out. The Empress Wei Zifu of Han, the woman who once held the heart of the emperor, was gone, leaving behind nothing but silence and the faint fragrance of chrysanthemum in the cold air. Outside, dawn broke fully over Chang'an. The empire continued its rituals. Drums sounded, officials gathered, and no one spoke her name aloud. For those who dared to remember, her death was not merely an ending. It was a lesson that in a world ruled by fear and ambition, even love must drink from the cup of obedience. When the news of her death reached Emperor Wu, the imperial court stood still. The emperor did not speak for a long time. He sat in the hall of endless peace, staring at the jade seal in his hands, as though it had turned to stone. The incense burned low. The courtiers shifted uneasily, waiting for his command, but none came. It was said that when he finally rose, his face had aged 10 years in a single night. For days, the emperor refused to eat. He wandered through the palace in silence, retracing the paths he had once taken to Wei Zifu's quarters. The courtyards were now empty, her rooms sealed by decree. He stood outside her chamber door, his hand hovering over the latch, then withdrew. Inside, he imagined the lingering scent of her perfume, the faint echo of her song, the song that had once made him believe that heaven itself had paused to listen. "Zifu?" he whispered, though there was no one left to answer. Then the truth came, as truth often does, late and cruel. The investigation revealed that Jiang Chong and his allies had fabricated the charges against both the crown prince and the empress. They had staged omens, falsified witnesses, and exploited the emperor's fear of betrayal for their own power. The entire conspiracy had been built upon lies. The emperor's fury was swift. Jiang Chong was executed, his family wiped from the records. The officials who had participated were stripped of titles and put to death. But vengeance brought him no peace. Every punishment only deepened his shame. He ordered the restoration of the crown prince's honor and the construction of a temple in his memory. There, offerings would be made to both mother and son, the innocent victims of imperial paranoia. The temple stood in quiet dignity beyond the city walls, where the wind from the plains could pass freely. The emperor visited it in secret, dressed not in his imperial robes, but in mourning clothes of plain white linen. Before the altar, he bowed deeply and whispered, "I wronged you both. The empire will remember my victories, but I will remember only this." In that confession, there was no redemption, only the acknowledgement of loss. He could not undo what had been done. As the years passed, Emperor Wu's health declined. He spoke less of conquest and more of dreams. Those close to him said that in the final years of his reign, he often woke at night murmuring Wei Zifu's name. In his chambers, he kept the bronze mirror that had once belonged to her, its surface darkened by time. He would gaze into it for hours, as if searching for her reflection, as if the mirror might open to the world where she still sang. When he died, the chroniclers wrote of his greatness, his reforms, his victories, his expansion of the Han Empire. But they also noted that in his last days, he ordered a decree that would echo through history. Let no witchcraft trials take place again in the palace. It was not justice, but it was an apology carved into the laws of an empire. And perhaps that was all he could give. Too late, too human, too real. Centuries passed, and dynasties rose and fell. The name of Emperor Wu remained in the records as one of China's greatest rulers, a man of brilliance and empire. But in the long corridors of memory, a softer story endured, that of the woman who once sang in a forgotten courtyard and whose voice had once calmed an emperor. Wei Zifu became more than an empress. She became a symbol of love silenced by fear, of beauty consumed by power, of the fragility of the human heart beneath the weight of a throne. Her temple eventually crumbled, her songs were lost, and yet her shadow lingers still, in poems, in legends, in the wind that passes through the ruins of Chang'an. For every empire built upon conquest leaves behind a single unanswered question. Was it worth the price of tenderness? Her story, like all tragedies, does not end with death. It ends with remembrance, because in the history of power, it is not the conquerors who haunt us, but the ones who were loved and forgotten.